Lord Richard Dannatt is former head of the British Army. Welcome to our program, Lord Dannatt.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is set to agree on a ceasefire in the air as a major concession to Trump, according to Bloomberg's sources close to Kremlin. What is your reaction to this, and what could be the main reasons behind this possible concession from Russia?
Well, we know that Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy, has had a further round of discussions in the Kremlin with Vladimir Putin. And other reports are that President Trump is willing to meet Vladimir Putin quite soon. So it may well be that this reported gesture by the Russians to offer a ceasefire in the air may be a step in the right direction towards getting negotiations going. The sadness is, of course, that in the past, whatever Vladimir Putin has suggested, he has then walked back from. And I think even Donald Trump has begun to doubt whether he would be able to do serious negotiations with Putin. But we'll have to see what the next few days bring.
Also, from your perspective, if Vladimir Putin agrees to this ceasefire in the air, what will this mean for the outcome of this war and for the possible settlement?
Well, you could argue that a ceasefire in the air is a first step in the right direction to end the fighting. Now, it's not a first step in the right direction to come up with a peace agreement. I think that is a very separate issue. But I think Ukrainian people and certainly the Russian military would probably like to see an end to the killing. But of course, the big issue that's very much there on the table is what is the future of Crimea and what is the future of the eastern provinces that are now occupied by Russian troops. We know that President Zelensky is quite clear that these parcels of land are all sovereign Ukrainian territory and they must be controlled by Ukraine. But Putin is insisting on his very hard line that he effectively wants Ukraine to surrender. Now, of course, that is unacceptable to all right-thinking Ukrainian people. So the discussions have to be about, is there some form of acceptable compromise there? But I think those discussions can only start if there is a ceasefire, not only in the air, but a ceasefire on the ground. But frankly, from my estimation of the situation, the two sides are their positions are so far apart that a compromise would appear to be irreconcilable, which is not a good position to be in. And it saddens me and many observers that this seems to be the situation.
Also, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that it appears that Russia is more inclined towards agreeing a ceasefire following their talks with US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in Moscow this week. Does this mean that Putin is trying to settle this war and is realizing that he should not miss this chance to reach a ceasefire deal?
Well, Putin certainly has to count the cost of this war, not just the cost in terms of his economy, but we all know that he's lost, excuse me, well over 1 million soldiers killed and wounded, and that is a very, very large number. He also knows that Donald Trump is threatening further sanctions, indirect sanctions, that could hurt the Russian economy. He's talking in terms of applying a 25% tariff on India to deter India buying Russian oil. So the pressure undoubtedly is building on Putin, both from an economic front and on a social front, to stop the casualties. So it may be that Putin is being edged closer towards the negotiating table, but I think we'll have to just see what happens over the next few days.
Don't you think that also Ukrainian operations deep inside Russia, like Spider Web, also forced Vladimir Putin to consider possible ceasefire in the air? because as a result of this operation, from 10 to 13 Russia's strategic bombers have been destroyed, or also Ukraine has intensified recent attacks on the Russian military targets, and also this drone attacks is causing many disruptions in civilian flight operations.
Well, there is no doubt that these Ukrainian deep attacks are having an effect. Putin can no longer say to his population, oh, this is a war that's just happening in Ukraine. It doesn't affect you at home. Well, it does affect the Russians at home. That big oil fire in Sochi, for example, the destruction of many aircraft on the ground. These were all brilliant operations carried out by Ukrainian military forces, and they are undoubtedly having an effect on Putin's decision-making and weighing up the costs of continuing the war. Now, we know that on the battlefield, at high casualty costs to themselves, the Russians are still making some slow progress on the ground. But again, it's all part of the accumulating cost on military casualties. And there is no doubt that Ukrainian deep attacks are having an effect as well.
Do you expect Russian military, Russian high command to support this idea of ceasefire in the air? Because it could also be beneficial for the Russian war machine to avoid another Ukrainian drone attacks deep inside Russia and deep inside Putin's war machine.
Well, there is no doubt that the Russians would be hoping that a reciprocal move by Ukraine would be to stop deep attacks into Russia. I think the Russian military high command and President Putin would like to see those attacks stopping. So it may be that offering a ceasefire in the air is a way of taking pressure off himself and taking pressure off the Russian people. But I think these are all ploys that are being played into a future negotiation. Of course, there are wider issues here that if Putin and Trump agree some kind of deal that President Zelensky is not able to agree to, there is a danger that the Americans will decide to withdraw their support from Ukraine. This will be a major challenge for European countries like mine to decide whether to continue to support Ukraine even without American assistance. And I think this is an issue that President Zelensky is currently talking with President Macron, Chancellor Merz and Prime Minister Starmer, amongst others at the present moment, to see what the European position would be. Personally, I believe it would be right, and I'm sure that the United Kingdom and other European countries will go on supporting Ukraine, but it will be increasingly difficult to do so without active and significant American military support.
If there is a ceasefire deal in the air, do you expect US President Trump to put even more pressure on Vladimir Putin after the possible ceasefire in the air to achieve full unconditional ceasefire on the ground?
Yes, I think that a ceasefire in the air would be a first step towards a wider ceasefire. But of course, from a European security point of view, there is another aspect that's important, and that is that, of course, once the Russians stop their attacks on the ground and in the air, then it gives them a chance to refurbish their military, to resupply their ammunition depots, and if there is not a wider settlement in Europe, for them to consider testing the strength of NATO by pressing some form of attack, maybe against one of the Baltic states, to test NATO's resolve to stand by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which is an attack on one member is an attack on all. So there are dangers for wider European security in there being a ceasefire in Ukraine, because it will provide an opportunity for the Russians to strengthen themselves to possibly press elsewhere. So there are many angles that have to be looked at here, not just the one from Ukraine, which of course from your people's point of view is the most important, and I fully understand that.
Also, let's cover sanctions against Russia. New sanctions against Russia should still be imposed this Friday. A White House official told Reuters. What is your assessment of this strategy of US President Donald Trump to negotiate with the Russians but still impose sanctions on Putin's war machine? And do you expect these sanctions to be imposed on Friday to be less harsh, less effective, rather than these sanctions which were discussed previously before negotiations in Moscow?
Well, Donald Trump likes to impose deadlines. We've seen that much more widely in his trade war and threat of tariff sanctions being applied to other countries. So far, it seems that Vladimir Putin is resistant to American timeline ultimatums. So I think the next 24 hours are going to be very interesting to see whether there is a realistic possibility of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump not just talking on the telephone, but maybe meeting face to face and seeing if there are grounds for some form of ceasefire. If those potential talks collapse, then unless Donald Trump is going to very publicly walk back from his ultimatum, walk back from the red lines that he's imposed, then he will have no option but to impose further sanctions on Russia, and also further sanctions on countries like India, who he criticizes for buying Russian oil. And then, of course, there is also the issue of China. America is in a very tight negotiation with China on trade issues. America wants to have a reasonable relationship with China. But given that China is buying a lot of Russian oil, the question has to be, what will Trump's attitude be towards China buying Russian oil? This is another complicating factor. So none of these things are straightforward, and there are many interwoven threads that all come together, which make these potential negotiations really quite difficult, very difficult.
If these negotiations between the US and Russia collapse, do you feel that President Trump has enough leverage over Russia to try to fully impose the sanctions? And does President Trump have enough leverage again over India and China to fully prevent these countries from buying Russia's crude oil?
I think if this potential round of negotiations collapses, then Donald Trump will not have many other options other than to impose more sanctions on Russia, and certainly trade sanctions on India with regard to buying Russian oil. And he'll have to decide what he's going to do with China, whether he's going to risk the relationship that he has with China and put more pressure on President Xi of China by imposing trade sanctions on China to deter them from buying Russian oil. So there's a lot at stake on whether these negotiations begin, whether they succeed, or whether they collapse. And if they collapse, then I think the Americans will have to up their support to Ukraine in military terms, but also put more pressure on the economic front on Russia in a variety of ways.
The US has also reached this deal with NATO to provide Ukraine with weapons, and Europe, NATO countries are paying for these new shipments of weapons from the US to Ukraine. What is your reaction to this new form of cooperation between the US and European allies?
Well, the important thing for Ukraine is that more weapons and more ammunition and other forms of support are made available. I think what is clever from Donald Trump's point of view is that he's saying to the Europeans, yes, we'll supply more stuff, but you buy it, and American defense companies will manufacture these things, and then we will ship them to Ukraine. So from Donald Trump's point of view, if he goes down that track, he will feel he's doing the right thing by making more support available to Ukraine, but he will also feel that economically he's doing the right thing by persuading European countries to buy American defense equipment, and that then be given to Ukraine. Now, having said that, there is nothing to stop European countries increasing their own industrial capacity, their own industrial output, for the European countries to produce more weapons and ammunition and to gift or loan that to Ukraine themselves. I think we'll see a combination of these things happening if there is a breakdown in negotiations.
Let's also cover a recent nuclear escalation between the US and Russia. US President Donald Trump has moved 2 nuclear submarines towards Russia in response to nuclear threats from Dmitry Medvedev, who now serves as deputy chairman of the Russia's Security Council. What is your take on this escalation and on this clash between President Trump and Dmitry Medvedev?
Well, I think most commentators believe that Dmitry Medvedev does not speak for the Kremlin at the present moment. And he's been pretty outspoken and has rattled the nuclear saber many times over the last 3 or 4 years or so. And he's done that again. Now, Donald Trump made one of his rather impromptu statements that he was going to move 2 nuclear submarines nearer to Russia. Well, the United States of America has got a lot of nuclear submarines, whether they're nuclear powered or nuclear weapons capable, and neither you nor I know where they are in the ocean at the present time. So in a sense, it was a predictable response to what Medvedev was saying, but I think most commentators are, while concerned, are not too concerned about the implications of that.
And do you feel that this decision of President Trump could trigger another escalation or some type of nuclear escalation between the US and Russia, because many people in the West are really concerned about the risks of such escalation after this decision?
Well, it's interesting and dangerous that we're having this conversation 80 years on from when the world's only 2 atomic bombs were dropped 80 years ago in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think the world has been reminded once again just how devastating these kind of weapons are. And I don't think it's in anybody's rational interest to seriously consider using nuclear weapons, even a so-called smaller tactical nuclear weapon. I also think that in the relationship between China and Russia, President Xi would put a very strong restraining hand on Putin if he thought the Russians were thinking about using a nuclear weapon, even a small one. I think that restraint which China would impose over Russia, I think is an encouraging thing. Yes, the nuclear threat remains, but it's not in anybody's interest to cross that nuclear threshold and start a nuclear exchange, even at the tactical level.
You just mentioned about China. Recently there was interesting publication of many details from the latest meetings between European and Chinese officials, and according to these publications, China does not want to see Russia losing this war in Ukraine. What is your assessment of the Chinese position in this regarding the outcome of this war?
Well, China and Russia have formed a very close relationship, and I think China would not want to see its partner, Russia, humiliated or embarrassed, and therefore will endeavor to go on supporting. But I think that support is measured. I think that support also is tempered by the remark I was making just now, that I think the Chinese leadership will continue to place restraint on the Russian leadership not to consider using nuclear weapons. So I think we have to watch that relationship very closely, but remember that China is the dominant partner in that relationship now, and that Russia is quite dependent on China in many ways, not the least of which is its ability to export some of its oil and gas to China, just in the same way that it's doing to India.
Let's cover our final topics, European nuclear deterrence and UK's nuclear deterrence. Recently, the US has repositioned nuclear and other nuclear assets to the United Kingdom for the first time since 2008. What is your reaction to this, and does it mean that the UK doesn't still need any type of tactical nukes to be produced?
Well, deterrence is all about preventing another country, another state, another party to do something. And you can only deter what someone else might do if your deterrent capability is itself credible. And I think what the United Kingdom has realized that yes, we have our strategic nuclear deterrent with the continuous at-sea submarine patrol program, but unlike in the years of the Cold War, we don't have a smaller, lower level tactical weapon capability. And the steps are being taken by purchasing 12 F-35A type aircraft that we could provide for ourselves a lower level nuclear capability, which will thicken up and broaden overall deterrence and therefore make the potential use of nuclear exchange less likely. So I think it's the right thing to do to make sure that the United Kingdom, like France and certainly like the United States, has got a nuclear deterrent capability, not just at the strategic level, but at the tactical level as well.
And also, what is your assessment of the current state of relations between the UK and the US and other NATO allies? Is Trump's administration is back committed to European security? Right now, there have been lots of discussions about the possibility of withdrawal of the US troops from Europe. It seems like these discussions are now being on a lower level. What is your take on that?
Well, this is all part of the wider discussion that's been going on for some time. President Trump is right insofar as European countries need to take a greater share of responsibility for our overall security. That's the security of Europe, including the security of Ukraine. But what is absolutely fundamental to NATO is that even if the United States is going to do less in Europe, we must keep the United States as part of NATO. That is extraordinarily important. So the balancing act that's got to be performed successfully by European leaders is to show that they are determined to play their full part in the security of Europe, allowing the Americans to focus more widely elsewhere, particularly in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific, in order to keep the Americans engaged, but recognize that America may do less to contribute towards European security and that we Europeans must do more for ourselves.
Thank you, Lord Dannatt, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed, and glory to Ukraine. And it's been a pleasure to join this conversation. Thank you.